I look forward to the results and on taking corrective measures. We cannot be complacent on this issue. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. Chair recognizes Mr. Biggs from Arizona for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this important hearing, and I appreciate our witnesses being with us today. Thank you so much. Mr. Chairman, I thank Buddy Carter of Georgia, who's done a lot of work in this area, and I request unanimous consent to submit into the record his report entitled Pulling Back the Curtain on PBMs. Thank you. I have serious concerns about the impact of concentration and apparent self-dealing activities in the pharmacy benefit manager market, which seems to be driving up costs for consumers. The largest 3 PBMs control about 80% of the market. CVS Caremark has 34%, Express Scripts 25%, and Optum Rx with 21%. Mr. Baker, thank you for being here today. Can you talk to with us about the role of PBMs, how that role has changed over time, how it went from where it started out, and how we got to where we are today, please?
Yes, thank you for the opportunity. And as I said in my opening statements, I think PBMs are critical to the American healthcare system. But as with many things in healthcare, there's a lot of blind spots where people can't see what's happening. Additionally, I think we've created a PBM industry where the general mantra is in chaos there is profit. So as we've talked about extensively today, this is a very complex, chaotic world. And I think a lot of that is by design, and we don't feel it needs to be that way. We feel that PBMs do a very good job in general of trying to keep down prices when they want to. But unfortunately, as you've brought up in the intervening years since they started their mission of, coordinating care for people and making sure that there's payment mechanisms for independent pharmacists to quickly get paid. These for-profit companies have created numerous pockets of money that they can hide and make sure that they're investing back in shareholder value, which is driving up costs for the American public, and that's probably not fair.
So the largest PBMs are vertically integrated. Do you think that is a practice that has increased or decreased prices?
Increased prices.
How about transparency for consumers? Has it increased transparency or decreased it?
Decreased.
Do you believe that this structure increases or decreases opportunities for self-dealing or conflicts of interest?
I think it increases those opportunities.
Has this structure led to delays for patients seeking medication?
It hurts patients.
Dr. Duane, have PBMs made it more difficult for veterans and service members in your community to access prescription drugs in a timely manner?
Absolutely.
How so, please?
Well, I mean, when they offer a contract to a pharmacy like us, it's completely unsustainable and would drive us out of business. It reduces the number of options that our servicemen and women have in order to obtain their drugs. So by definition, that would, a decrease in access would increase difficulty.
Beginning in 2019, many of the largest PBMs began forming group purchasing organizations based in Switzerland and Ireland. These decisions were framed as steps to increase their bargaining power to negotiate lower drug prices. Mr. Baker, have consumers seen any reductions in prescription drug costs since these decisions were made?
By all metrics I'm aware of, no.
Have they produced increased transparency either?
Not at all.
How does your PBM differ from large PBMs, and what has your experience been competing with larger players?
It's a very interesting world trying to compete with the largest PBMs. I think in general there's a misnomer that the industry likes to push that the bigger guys get the best deal and pass those deals on. And I think as we've seen through some of the illustrations here today, that is generally incorrect. We have made it a point that we will never make money on a drug. So any money we get from a pharmaceutical manufacturer we believe should be pushed to the client to benefit them and their members. We will not create spread on independent pharmacists, so we want to pay them a fair wage for the job that they do and pass that exact cost along to the client as well with full transparency.
So, Mr. Chairman, some of the things I've heard is we are in a milieu of chaos and that facilitates hiding pockets of money, reducing transparency, reducing options for patients. I am grateful that you're holding this hearing today. I think this is something that we need to continue to work on, look at, and with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Chair recognizes Mr. Mafume from Maryland for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. I particularly just want to add to all the others who have spoken here about our thanks to you and the ranking member for holding this hearing. It is so vital And I'm sure that people who are watching this after a while are scratching their heads and wondering, how do these so-called PBMs, who are really pharmacy benefit mismanagers, sleeping at night? This is a damn shame. That's the only way that I can describe it. This is a damn shame that Americans have to be ripped off in this manner and for it to continue over and over and over again. Dr. Atkins, I was particularly moved by your testimony about your patients in Georgia. It's heart-wrenching. And your bottom line was that drugs don't work if people can't afford them. And there's so many people that can't afford them. Household spending on health care has increased in the past 3 decades, increasingly with detrimental impacts, as we all know, on our nation's seniors, on people with disabilities, on other patients who are treated by Medicare. And we are at a crossroads right now, I think, in this nation, which is why there is this demonstration of bipartisan support, but also bipartisan anger at what is, for lack of a better term, a real ripoff. People are dying while companies are profiting. In my own state, the Maryland Prescription Drug Price Affordability Board documented more than 1,200 prescription drugs with prices that outpace the rate of inflation throughout just last year alone. That translates into real people facing real crises. Case in point, Kyle, whose last name will remain anonymous for this hearing, his wife is from Baltimore City. She has lupus, as well as a degenerative disc disease, and is currently on multiple medications. The cost of her prescriptions amount to $1,200 every 3 months, and her doctor's visit adds another $1,000 to that. Kyle is retired. He had to return to work because he had no other choice to try to find a way to qualify for benefits to support his wife's medical expenses, but most of all, to keep his wife alive. John from Baltimore County was diagnosed with multiple myeloma and recently finished bone marrow treatment. John now takes 21 doses of Revlimid, and each pill costs $990. He needs the drug to keep his cancer under control and has been left with no other choice but to beg for the generosity of drug manufacturers and these pharmaceuticals. So those, unfortunately, are just a few stories of the many, many millions of stories that represent the realities for people. Some of them are our families, some of them are our friends, they are our neighbors, and they are looking to us to end this practice, to end this kind of foolishness. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to submit to the record the report last year of the prescription drug affordability community forums that happened throughout the state of Maryland, taking testimony from persons of all walks of life.
Without objection, so ordered.
I just want to say a couple of other things. I don't like getting angry like this, but when you hear something that's hurting people in this way, it cries out for solutions. I don't like the fail first policy and practice, which is absolutely ridiculous. I don't like the fact that the preferred drug offered up is oftentimes the most expensive drug. We all are ticked off of this notion of ongoing price gouging, the lack of transparency, and the fact that no one seems to regulate the PBMs, but the PBMs. They're having a field day out there, getting rich over and over and over again. They're practicing medicine without a license, ladies and gentlemen. They're making determinations that oftentimes end the lives of people who cannot fight back for themselves. And so I hope and pray that out of this committee and out of this very important hearing comes bipartisan legislation to create a solution to end this once and for all. It is a sin, it is an abomination, and it is an affront to everything that we hold moral and right in this country. Thank you again, Mr. Chair, to you and the ranking member, and I would yield back.
Thank you, and we look forward to working with you, Mr. Mafume. Chair now recognizes Mr. LaTurner from Kansas for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to all of those on the panel today. Mr. Baker, There have been many allegations of PBMs participating in spread pricing, where they pay pharmacies less for generic drugs than they're charging insurance providers, and then they pocket the difference. In my home state of Kansas, accusations of this practice were recently settled for $26.7 million. Can you explain more about how the spread pricing model works and why it's controversial?
Yes, thank you, sir. So again, at the end of the day, spread pricing is as simple as the pharmacy middleman has all the rules, they have all the data, and they don't share a lot of that, so people don't really know what's going on. So unfortunately, independent pharmacists are getting paid a low amount for the prescriptions that they're dispensing to help communities live better, healthier lives. And then self-funded employers have a separate contract with these pharmacy benefit managers. And then the PBM can sit in the middle and say, hey, so here's $10 for the prescription that you dispensed and the hard work that the independent pharmacist did. Self-funded employer, I'm going to charge you $20 then for that same prescription because you really don't know what I paid the pharmacy over here. And it creates a lot of opacity and a lot of opportunities for profiteering.
Thank you. Dr. Duane, I'm interested in knowing more about your contracts with PBMs. Pharmacies contract with PBMs in order for the pharmacy to participate in the PBM's network, correct?
Yes.
What does it mean to be in a PBM's network?
Well, for our practice, it means everything. Sometimes when people think they hear networks, they may think of like the idea of a preferred network or a non-preferred network like we might have in Medicare. But I mean, to be in a PBM's network means that I can bill the PBM and receive payment for services. If I'm not in their network, it means that I can't take a single cent from them and that the patient would be forced to pay the full out-of-pocket cost.
How do pharmacies join these networks?
Well, I mean, there are several different ways that we can join. In some of them, I simply ask, you know, in others, we have administrative organizations that can help us join on our behalf.
Is it difficult for an independent pharmacy to participate in a PBM's network?
It's very difficult. It's twofold, the question is. Number one, it's difficult sometimes to even get a contract offered to you. But secondly, it can be difficult to get a contract that makes you whole or even to participate. So even though you get a contract, it may not be one that makes sense for you to be able to participate in.
Independent pharmacies across the country have been shut out due to PBM anti-competitiveness practices, correct?
Absolutely, we have, yes.
PBMs sometimes pay competing pharmacies, that is, pharmacies they do not control, lower amounts than they pay the pharmacies that they do control. A lack of transparency, however, sometimes allows them to claim they paid competing pharmacies higher reimbursements than they actually did. There have been a number of lawsuits to recoup such overpayments. For example, Ohio Medicaid was overcharged $223.7 million, and Kentucky Medicaid was overcharged $123.5 million. What should Congress be doing to prevent this practice in the future?
Thank you for that question. That's a great question. I think it's very simple. I think it's twofold. Number one, I think you have to get rid of the rebates. I've heard a lot about how Big Pharma is the one who's making the prices. Big Pharma is the one that keeps pushing it up. And please make no mistake, I'm not carrying any water for Big Pharma. But I think that the problem is that these rebates really obscure what the true price is. And you hear this concept of the gross to net bubble. And you can say that, well, the gross list price of a drug goes up, but after the rebates, the price actually decreased over time. So, I mean, you have to be able to get rid of those in order to make sure that we're playing with a full deck of cards. The second thing that you need to do is I think that we need to look at what the Medicaid program in some states does, and that's that they reimburse based on a fair, evidence-based, reference-based price for the drug, and then they reimburse on a fair, reference-based, evidence-based price for our services. And I think that there is some legislation looking at that in the Medicaid space federally right now, and the CBO scored at a saving $1 billion over 10 years. So I mean, that is a no-brainer to me, and I think it makes sense because, you know, there may be a drug that, metformin, it's a common drug for diabetes, it's very, very, very inexpensive. It's one of it's one of the most life-saving drugs that you can prescribe for a diabetic, and it's very, very inexpensive. We make almost no money on it at all. But there are other drugs that are, you know, vanity drugs or lifestyle drugs or something like that we make quite a bit more money on. And that doesn't make sense because the labor is the same. So by anchoring the price to a reference-based price in ingredient cost and a reference-based price in service fee, you ensure that everyone's getting the best deal, but that competition can still exist.
I appreciate your time, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Chair now recognizes Ms. Ocasio-Cortez from New York for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you for this hearing, Mr. Chair. I think it's incredibly important that we tackle these issues substantively. And I've been very surprised to hear some of the commentary across the other side of the aisle. I heard earlier a Republican saying someone should go to jail for how expensive some drugs are in this country, and I thought I saw a pig flying across the ceiling of this committee room. But where there is common ground, I think we should pursue it, and we should pursue it aggressively. Now, I want to take a step back here and really make sure that we are illustrating this issue in a way that the public can understand. Because if we do that, then I think we can all get on the same page about developing energy towards a solution. So if I'm just an everyday person and I'm getting a prescription from my doctor and I get that prescription, I take it to my pharmacist, and then all of a sudden I get a bill and I realize that my insurance copay, whether it's for any condition, diabetes, cancer, whatever it may be, it could be $1,000. And before you know it, you're paying your rent check on a medication that you need to save your life. And we need to take a step back and figure out, how did we get here? Especially on drugs like insulin, where there's a public patent and there really is no reason for it to be that expensive. So we see that there's a drug between the drug and you receiving that at a pharmacy. There are several steps. You have your drug manufacturer, which folks call Big Pharma. Then you have your insurer. Those are the areas that I think people understand. Someone makes the drug, someone insures that drug that I can buy it, but then there's someone in the middle, and that is known as a PBM, or a pharmacy benefit manager. Isn't that correct, Mr. Asasi?
Yes.
And so what we see is that the drug manufacturer very often does not sell their medication directly to the pharmacy, or does not sell their medication directly to the insurer, but there is this middle person known as a PBM, and they will set a price. The manufacturer will set a price very high, and the PBM will say, let's make a deal. And they say, if you give me a rebate, then I can make the formulary for the insurance, and I can make sure that your drug gets covered by this insurance. You can sell a lot of your drug, and then all is well in the world. And that's the general concept, the pitch from the PBM. Isn't that right? Do I have that correct?
There's a few more middlemen, but that's exactly it in a nutshell.
And each step along the way, someone is taking a cut.
Yep.
You've got the manufacturers charging, you've got the PBMs charging, you have insurers, and then before you know it, you're paying a rent check on insulin, which should cost virtually nothing. Now, my question here is that we have to figure out a solution. We have a vicious cycle with the PBMs because they say, if you give me a rebate, I'll pass it on to the insurers. So the drug manufacturer says, great, I'll make my price even higher. So I'll say that my list price for a drug is $5,000, so then I can charge you $1,000 or even more, and I'll make you seem like you're getting a deal so that you'll put me on a higher level in the formulary. And all about this process is focused on who's making how much money, instead of what people are getting the treatment that they need. Now, I'm very curious, genuinely, to hear from the other side of the aisle and some of our witnesses here today. Everyone okay over there? From the other side of the aisle and some of our witnesses here today about solutions. I'll be candid about mine. I believe that the profit-seeking motive in the pharmaceutical industry is out of control, and I think that it is what is hurting people. I personally believe that if you have a public entity that does not have a profit motive, like Medicare, negotiate these prices with the manufacturers, including the transparency that we see, along with other entities like TRICARE, Medicaid, et cetera, then we can get an actual fair price for these medications that includes their manufacturing and R&D costs, but will not finance stock buybacks and other types of predatory behavior. And then I believe that Medicare should expand its eligibility so that people can buy into at-cost public insurance. Now, I understand that not everyone in this room agrees with that assessment. I am very curious to hear about any other proposals, because I think at the core, what we're talking about is an extreme, out-of-control profit motive that has virtually no guardrails, and that Congress doesn't impose guardrails on for a whole bunch of other dark money reasons. And so I'm interested to hear from Dr. Atkins, Mr. Asasi, Dr. Duane, and Mr. Baker. In addition, we've heard about things like eliminating rebates. We've heard about things about increasing transparency. I think those are very important steps. I'm curious about what other solutions, whether broadly systemic or more tailored, that you all would propose to this committee that we consider in order to help actually solve this problem and go beyond talking about it.
I just wanted to say really quickly, you put your finger right on it. Right on it. At the end of the day, the only reason PBMs exist is because we don't have the ability to fairly negotiate with Big Pharma. So we came up with PBMs. And I want to be really clear, this idea of repealing the rebate, this was under the Trump administration. The CBO scored that at $170 billion in cost, because PBMs are actually saving us money, right? But the fundamental problem, first of all, as we've heard about, one is in Medicare, PBMs have to operate under what's called a medical loss ratio, where we limit the amount of money they can make in profits. That doesn't exist in other areas, right? So first of all, let's put them on some guardrails and say, look, at the end of the day, this isn't going to be about you putting money in your coffers. It's about getting a good price for the American family, right? Two, to the same end, we got to create a lot more transparency, particularly for like the Federal Employees Health Benefit Program we heard about, or other large employers, right? That they can actually see what is the fundamental, the net price I'm paying, so that they can actually track and keep and hold them accountable. But let's not forget, at the end of the day, when you look at all the money flowing through the system, the manufacturers are getting 12 times more profit than everyone else. So this is all about one major problem. Drug makers are extorting obscene prices from the American public, and it needs to end.
Chair recognizes Mr. Palmer from Alabama for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to ask Mr. Baker some questions about when your firm develops your formularies, does the higher priced drugs, which you get higher rebates from, does that factor into the decision about what drugs you'll cover?
No, sir. We always look at the clinical criteria first and then drive to lowest net cost
All right,
second.
I've got several things I want to cover, following up on the gentlelady from New York. She raised some good points. So the PBMs act as middlemen between the drug manufacturers and players like payers like health insurance for discounts on the drugs in the form of rebates. She made that point. What I want to know is, where's that money going?
That's definitely the big question. I don't think we have transparency to completely understand.
But is it possible that the PBMs are pocketing the difference because it's not getting back to the patient?
That would be my contention as well.
They've indicated that the PBMs have increased required fees while reducing the rebates in order to avoid passing these discounts on to patients. Do you think that's the case?
I believe so, yes, sir.
Are you familiar with rebate aggregators?
Yes, sir.
Could you explain what they are?
Yes. And if you look at the end of the day, there's been, I know, a lot of talk about the fact that manufacturers make 12 times as much as everybody else. And I do want to point out manufacturers are actually making life-saving drugs for everybody. These GPOs were established, 2 of the 3 overseas. If you go online and you look on LinkedIn, I've never been able to find more than 30 people associated with these big 3 GPOs, and they're bringing in close to $200 billion a year in revenue for 3 entities. So where the money goes, I think, is anybody's best guess. But they do have numerous fees that they charge. They keep those fees inside of their own organization for profit purposes and to drive shareholder value. And then what actually trickles out the other end, I don't think anybody really understands what went in the top versus what went in the bottom and how much is kept in the middle.
You made a point just now that I think needs to be followed up on. That is that these aggregators are sometimes located in foreign countries. Is that correct? Like Switzerland, Ireland?
That is correct.
What drives that business to those countries?
That is a very good question. I think we can only speculate.
Could it be that we have so overregulated on our end? I mean, I think there's a problem on both ends of this, that our regulatory regime has created an environment that forces things overseas. I know in 1996, President Clinton signed a bill repealing Section 936 of the IRS code that devastated the pharmaceutical industry, manufacturing industry in Puerto Rico, literally put Puerto Rico in depression. But we also had an issue with taxes. I know of one Chicago-based pharmaceutical company bought an Irish pharmaceutical company so that a higher enough percentage of the company would be located in Ireland. They could avoid the U.S. tax rates. It was 12.5% in Ireland. Is that part of the problem?
That would be my guess, but I do not have facts to state otherwise.
Part of my concern is when they have these aggregators overseas, it's a form of tax evasion, isn't it?
I will rely on your expertise on the IRS code.
I'm asking you. This is not an IRS code. This is a business question issue. Are they making business decisions to avoid paying higher taxes by locating $200 billion in profits overseas?
I was not there when they made those decisions, but again, I think it definitely looks like that's what was occurring.
Are you familiar with PBM practice of spread pricing, and can you explain why there's a controversy around that?
Yes, sir. I think depending on what happens with the money that's actually spread. So some people contend that when that spread occurs, the monies go back and help drive down plan costs. And if that's the case and we have transparency around it, it might not be a bad thing. My general contention is the opposite, that I think more often than not, spread pricing is just used in a world where nobody sees what's occurring to drive profits back to these large organizations, and that's a bad thing.
So you could be directing patients to use certain medications to receive the larger rebates, and because we don't have the transparency, we really can't track it. Is that what you're saying?
That's a very accurate statement.
Mr. Chairman, I think this is an extremely important hearing. I think we've gotten some information from the witnesses that I think will be constructive in working together in a bipartisan way to come up with some solutions to help patients. And one of the things I think we need to look at is where a lot of these profits are landing. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Chair now recognizes Ms. Bush from Missouri for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. St. Louis and I are here today specifically in support of Medicare for all and health care as a human right, leaving life or death medical decisions in the hands of drug manufacturers and multi-billion-dollar PBMs instead of patients and their health care providers is literally killing people. Let's put this conversation into context. In the wake of a deadly pandemic that has left millions traumatized, disabled, and suffering long-term health challenges, Republicans are using the debt limit to needlessly restrict access to Medicare and Medicaid. This will leave millions more uninsured or underinsured and have to rely on predatory corporations like PBMs to receive medical care. As we've heard today, pharmacy benefit managers are intermediaries that negotiate with drug manufacturers, health insurers, and pharmacies to determine the cost and the coverage of medicine. As a nurse, I've seen America's broken healthcare system force patients to make the impossible choice between paying for life-saving medication or buying groceries. I've seen them cry because their medications were changed and the doctor ordered one thing and they were not able to get that particular medication because of this broken healthcare system. When congressional Democrats and the Biden administration worked to pass the Inflation Reduction Act, we capped the price of insulin for Medicare beneficiaries and empowered Medicare to directly negotiate lower prices for drugs. But St. Louis and I know that we still have such a long way to go. That's why Senator Bernie Sanders and I recently introduced the Insulin for All Act, historic legislation to rein in Big Pharma and cap the price of insulin at $20 per vial for every person who depends on insulin to live. The privatization of our healthcare system itself is at stake, which is why I stand with my colleagues and I demand Medicare for all be enacted now. Dr. Dwayne, according to a 2019 study by the American Medical Association, 1 in 8 pharmacies closed between 2009 and 2015, and these closures disproportionately affected independent pharmacies in low-income neighborhoods. In St. Louis, 15% of residents live more than a mile away from a pharmacy, and the lack of trust in culturally insensitive medical providers, which I've seen firsthand, can pose just as great a barrier to accessing care as a lack of transportation. What can be done, Dr. Dwayne, to level the playing field so independent pharmacies like Greater Health in my district can keep serving our communities and those hard-to-reach populations?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for the question. I think that the biggest thing that we could do is to make sure that providers are being not asked to subsidize any system that is in place. And I think that like my pharmacy is in a predominantly low-income area as well. And sometimes we have to make heavy decisions about whether we participate in certain Medicare plans or whether we participate in certain Medicaid plans because we know that it won't be sustainable for us to do so. And that's not a choice that as a healthcare provider I should have to make. I should just be able to do what I went to school, what God put me on this earth to do, which is to care for people. So I think that anything that we look at has to be looked at through the lens of making sure that the practitioners that are here to serve all patients, those underserved patients included, make sure that they're able to do so in a sustainable manner based on not the profitability of 3, Fortune 12 companies, but of what we as practitioners need, the resources, the tools in order to do what's right by those patients.
Yeah, thank you for those insights. This industry is dominated by 3 big PBMs that control about 80% of the entire market. These PBMs also integrated with insurance companies and pharmacies to funnel business toward their own pharmacies at the expense of our independent community pharmacies, which our communities lean on. Dr. Dwayne, does this create a conflict of interest, in your opinion?
It absolutely does. I think that no matter what walk of life you come from or what kind of insurance you carry, you ought to be able to choose the person that you receive care from. And when the PBMs restrict their networks or when they, steer you through the advertising that they send to your home or the logo that they print on your insurance card, it makes you second guess yourself or wonder, if you can go to a certain practitioner or if you're forced to go to a different pharmacy or something like that. So I think that it does disadvantage people because, this is a very difficult concept for someone like me who lives it and breathes it every day, but for someone who, is of low health literacy or is just not able to involve themselves in their care to the extent that they may want to, it becomes almost insurmountable to understand really the complexities of that system. And I think that the PBMs end up taking advantage of that. And they rely on people to not investigate and instead to just kind of, go with their intention, which is to push them to the pharmacy that they stand to benefit from the most.
And with that, I yield back. Thank you, Dr. Dwayne.
Thank you. Chair recognizes Mr. Fallon from Texas for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So much of this is head-scratching, the formularies and gross-to-net bubbles and aggregators. It kind of makes my brain hurt a little bit, to be quite honest. I think it's purposely complex, though. I think there's a method to the madness. And I see in my colleague from Georgia, Congressman Buddy Carter, a great pharmacist in his own right, I was reading through this, and kind of in the middle, he made mention that 2,300 independent pharmacies the United States lost 2,300 independent pharmacies between just December of 2017 to 2020, in just 3 years. That scares me as a small business owner, former small business owner. And I just curious, Dr. Dwayne, do you think this is in part because it's so difficult for independent pharmacies to join PBMs, that we've lost so many in just 3 years?
Well, it can sometimes be a lose-lose because if the PBM offers a contract to us that's unsustainable and we take it, it runs us out of business quicker. If we decline a contract that's unsustainable, their affiliate pharmacies stand to gain those same members that I do not serve for that reason. So yes, I think it is.
You think it's fair to say, it seems to me PBMs, we've seen as spending on drugs has decreased as a percentage of overall healthcare expenditure since 2009, but I think it perhaps could be the vulturous vertical integration that is not helpful in any regard. In the fall of 2022, Express Scripts announced that they would be reducing prescription reimbursements for almost 10 million TRICARE members. Additionally, 15,000 primarily rural and independent pharmacies were dropped from the TRICARE networks. That's particularly concerning to me because I represent 10 rural counties. Options for TRICARE patients and their families were reduced, especially, again, in rural communities. The TRICARE pharmacy network was temporarily reopened in November of 2022 after significant congressional pressure. To my knowledge, no new pharmacies rejoined the networks. So, Mr. Baker, you may not be able to speak this from direct experience on the issue, but I'd like for you to talk about how this impacts access and competition. It was reported that Express Scripts removed rural staples like Walmart, Kroger, Sam's Club in favor of CVS, of course, a pharmacy owned by one of the other big three. As a smaller PBM competing with the big three, do you find it harder to compete in the market?
We absolutely do, yes, sir, yeah.
Have you seen evidence of the big three playing favorites with or preferring pharmacies that they own over other pharmacy options?
I think when we deal with jumbo self-funded employers who have mandatory mail and specialty programs, that's very obvious, yes, sir.
And if we're removing competition from TRICARE networks, how does that improve service and lower costs?
We agree that it does not do either of those things.
And what's particularly concerning me is when you have three PBMs owning 80% of the market share and then 82% of Americans participating in this, that is very concerning. And Dr. Duane, did you know Admiral Kevin Delaney, by the way?
I do not know.
You didn't know? Okay, just curious. He was a staple in Jacksonville. You spoke in your opening statement about how TRICARE covered patients are affected by PBM pharmacy network changes. How is this impacting our veterans community?
It's terrible. I mean, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. There was a story on the local NBC channel the week before last that said that people were waiting days, sometimes weeks, for their medicine. I don't think that's any fault of the Navy base. I think they're working with as much as they can, but I think that, you know, what you mentioned, the dropping of tens of thousands of pharmacies almost overnight, and then you spoke to the reopening of the network. I can tell you that I examined that contract fairly and closely, and I looked, and on any typical brand name medicine, we would have lost somewhere between $20 and $30 every time we tried to fill a medicine, and that's before we talk about the $10 or $12 that it takes to fill a medicine and break even. So I mean, you're talking about $40 to $50 sometimes at that point. So I think that they have markedly reduced option now to get their medicine. The options that do exist in Jacksonville are overburdened and overstressed as a result, and I think that ultimately that leads to poorer patient care, and I don't think that that can be argued.
Okay. Well, Mr. Chairman, what I've seen here is a lot of more agreement than I've seen in the 2.5 years I've been in Congress, just today. So I think we do have a mandate, and we should be talking about solutions. I think these rebates, kickbacks, whatever you want to call them, are something that probably we need to address and eliminate and prohibit moving forward. But this is something that we have an opportunity. Let's do the right thing by the American people. Let's work together and let's fix this. Thank you very much, and I yield back.
Absolutely. Thank you. Chair recognizes Ms. Brown from Ohio for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am pleased that this hearing presents an opportunity to consider broad bipartisan agreement regarding the dangers of a healthcare system that prioritizes profits over people. We cannot lose sight of the big picture. Caring for the sick and providing life-saving medications should not be a cash cow opportunity. It is staggering that last year alone, pharma spent $8.1 billion on advertising, while millions of Americans still can't afford their medications. This kind of behavior by big pharma and pharmacy benefit managers, or PBMs, squeezes those in greatest need who have the fewest resources. So, Dr. Dunn, I appreciated hearing your testimony about your work as an independent pharmacist. Could you tell us why it is important patients have access to a local pharmacy they trust?
Yes, thank you. So people need to be able to go to a pharmacy that they know will be able to take care of their complex medication regimens. And I think that the average person sees their pharmacist a lot more than they see their doctor. So I think that it's very important that they have a variety of choice, because someone needs to, just like any other healthcare practitioner, have a level of trust and confidence in that person that they're receiving care from.
Thank you so much for that. And I want to circle back, as stated by my colleague, Rep. Bush, according to one of the studies in 2019, 1 in 8 pharmacies closed between 2009 and 2015. This is deeply unfortunate, especially for those who rely on their neighborhood pharmacies for more than just their prescription pickup. Now, we heard from Dr. Duane when he responded to Ms. Bush's question, but I want to ask you, Mr. Asasi, If you could elaborate a little bit more on how the closure of an independent or community pharmacy limits healthcare access for a patient living in a low-income urban setting.
You bet. So important to say that pharmacists can play a critical role in the ability of people to get high-quality health care. There's wonderful examples across this country. North Carolina Community Cares comes to mind, where they help patients who are coming out of really complex inpatient procedures, and pharmacists played a key role in continuity of care and making sure they were okay. When you move people to mail-order pharmacies, you move people out of community-based settings, you lose all of that context. And for folks who are in underserved communities, they already have much less access to doctors, nurses, et cetera. Pharmacists can be on the very front line and very effective. So it's a really concerning trend if we are creating financial incentives that are closing the access patients have to their pharmacists.
Thank you so much. According to the same study, in 2019, closures were twice as likely to occur for independent pharmacies located in lower-income neighborhoods. These pharmacy closures, as you stated, make it more difficult for the people that are already more likely to experience health disparities to access care and medication. I also continue to call for greater transparency from PBMs on how and why specific drugs make it into their formularies. This secretive selection process of winners and losers where PBMs make backroom deals with manufacturers is just unacceptable. I am proud of the achievements that congressional Democrats delivered in the Inflation Reduction Act, elevating quality care for vulnerable populations and dramatically lowering the cost of prescription drugs for Medicare patients. Democrats are committed to putting patients over profits, and we will continue to fight to make health care more accessible and more affordable. I want to thank the chairman and the witnesses today for their testimonies. This is a very important issue, as you can see by the level of participation and the collaboration of both Democrats and Republicans. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you. Chair recognizes Mr. Edwards from North Carolina for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks to all of our witnesses for being with us today. I'm curious, as we look at some of these examples on the charts earlier today, and there's no denying there is reason to be alarmed with those margins. Can any of you point to any impetus that may have led to these types of margins, or is this something that has grown over time? If it's grown over time, for what period of time has it grown to this point? Anyone?
Yes, I'll go ahead and get that started. I think it starts in the reality that healthcare is generally run by for-profit companies that need to make more money next year, the year after, and the year after. I would note we do not think that for-profit companies are a bad thing, but we have designated ourselves as a public benefit corporation. I love the comments. Our motto is same as patients over profits. I think if we focus on patients first, you can still do the right thing and bring a lot of good to this world. But I think it also hits what we call in the industry a lot the balloon squeeze, right? So as somebody starts looking in one area of PBM profitability, there's always another profitable area that kind of pops up in a more opaque fashion. So depending on how they need to maintain their profitability to achieve better shareholder value year over year, I think that's why those situations occur.
And the only thing I would add to that is the fish stinks from the head down, right? The problem, the reason these prices have gone up so fast is because the manufacturers are charging outrageous prices. The PBMs are just a set of those middlemen who are siphoning off those outrageous prices. And what we've seen is in Medicare, for example, we do have medical loss ratio requirements where we can limit the amount of profit that they can make. But in other sectors, it's not transparent. We don't know. And there seems to be a lot of gaming around rebates. And so we need much greater transparency and guardrails, right? But they are negotiating a better rate than we would get if we just went straight to the manufacturer.
Thank you for that. My next question is, as I have heard, because this is not a new issue, I've served in the North Carolina Senate for a number of years, and this was something that was always at the forefront. I have heard from drug manufacturers that they need to charge more than cost for drugs in order for research and development to add additional cures for diseases, to create drugs that would have less side effects and that sort of thing. Do any of you have an opinion?
Yes, I absolutely do. And just to make it very clear, first of all, the deal that was struck under patent law for drug manufacturers was go out there and find a cure for cancer and make a bunch of money for a limited period of time, 9 years, 12, 11 years, depending, and then go find something else. Every single moment that we let drug manufacturers use patent thickets and games so that they're making money from existing drugs, we are disincentivizing innovation. And to be very clear, this is a direct quote from a Stanford business professor in Forbes magazine. In the 21st century, most drug companies have replaced moonshots with chip shots, strategies aimed at minimizing risk rather than chasing the elusive game-changing drug. Today's biopharma giants focus on monetizing easy wins. We know they are spending much more on marketing than they are on research and development.
All right, thank you for that. My last question, Dr. Duane, is in the North Carolina legislature. Again, this was this was at the forefront, and what we did in North Carolina is that we gave more authority to our insurance commissioners and feel like we gave him the tools to better make transparent transactions with PBMs and to regulate them. Have you seen any other states take any actions, and can you comment on what you see working in the states, what you see not working, and any advice that you've got for this Congress as a result of what we've learned from what's taken place in the states?
So I think that states have taken steps for that. The state I live in Florida, has just recently passed a large bill to address a lot of the things that we've talked about today, like spread pricing. In the state of Florida, the legislature, working with the governor, made sure that rebates were passed down directly to the point of sale to the patient to make sure that it lowers their out-of-pocket costs through their premiums that they pay and their co-pays at the pharmacy counter. So I think that that's important. Other states have looked at reference-based pricing structures and reference-based dispensing fee structures. So I think that yes, that there are states that have taken the lead, and I think in doing so, they have. I mean, certainly we don't hear about states' actions that have been taken that have risen drug prices faster than what we see nationally. So I think that that speaks for itself, what the states are doing and how they're regulating, and their Office of Insurance Regulation and those kinds of things have lowered costs, because we have heard nothing to the opposite.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, I yield. Thank you.
Thank you. Chair recognizes Mr. Garcia of California for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses for being here. We appreciate your time. And I think we can all agree that certainly here in our country, as the wealthiest nation on earth, we should be ensuring that everyone has access to high-quality, affordable health care all across our country, regardless of whether someone is in between jobs or able to work, or whatever their condition is, whatever their age is. Now, we know that the Inflation Reduction Act has made really great progress in this area, and we're really grateful to the work of the administration. The issue of the cost of prescription drugs is a critical issue for our country. We know that the prescription drug industry overall has failed to prevent prices and price surges as a history in this country, and we know that pharmacy benefit managers play a role in that, and so I appreciate all of the comments that have been made. Now, for millions of people, we know that these people make impossible choices. I've heard it back home. We all hear it from constituents, and the choices of medication, the choice of paying rent, the choice of being late on bills is a real thing for so many Americans, for seniors especially, and for low-income folks as well. And I appreciate this hearing, but I just want to remind us and make it crystal clear that the biggest obstacle to fair pricing is Big Pharma, period. I'll say it again. The biggest obstacle to fair pricing is Big Pharma. They wield the most power in this market. And so this hearing is really important. I would love to have a hearing with the heads of all of Big Pharma to be able to ask them the questions as to why they're price gouging the average American. I think that is also very important, and an important conversation that we need to have. Now, we know that in the 5-year period between 2016 and 2020, pharmaceutical companies raised their prices on drugs 36%, almost 4 times the rate of inflation during that same period. And this is something that's continuing to happen. We don't see it stopping. Now, we've done some incredible work, and I want to thank the President again. The Inflation Reduction Act and the work it's doing around Medicare and the capping of prices is really, really important. This has been a priority. It's finally getting done, and we want to thank President Biden for that. Now, this committee had found that from 2014 to 2018, taxpayers lost $25 billion in savings on 7 drugs alone because Medicare cannot negotiate those prices. Now we're going to have some reform. We're going to have some change, which we want to encourage. I want to also just say for the record, I've been a long advocate for Medicare expansion. I mean, Medicare should be covering everyone, in my personal opinion. Medicare is popular. We should be building on that work, and I just wanted to make sure we noted that. Going back to pharmacy benefit managers, it seems clear to me that essentially a lot of pharmacy benefit managers are essentially extracting fees, serving as middlemen, and not passing on, in my opinion, a lot of value or significant value to consumers or the public. And we should always be looking at unnecessary costs and strategies to uphold monopoly pricing. Now, monopoly power is a huge concern in the pharmaceutical space, as well as for pharmacy benefit managers, where 3 companies control 80% of the market. That's been discussed already in this hearing. Mr. Baker, can you also, again, briefly, once again, describe why consolidation hurts consumers?
Yes, I think at the end of the day, when you look at the fact that 3 of these organizations are controlling hundreds of billions of dollars of revenue, it gives them the ability to basically make whatever rules they want to drive to higher costs. And then those higher costs, as we've discussed today, always fall back to a percentage of profit for them. So it allows them to drive to that higher profit.
And this monopoly that's currently in place in our country, it is hurting the average Americans and especially low-income folks and seniors. Would you agree?
I think that's accurate, yes, sir.
Do you think it's fair to say that this consolidation is directly allowing these benefit managers and for the pharmaceutical space in general to price gouge?
I would agree with that, yes, sir.
I think we obviously need to look at more enforcement, and so I think something I hope the committee looks at as well in the future is how we're going to enforce and ensure that this price gouging isn't happening. What we have essentially going on right now is a monopoly system that is causing direct harm to consumers and to folks within our healthcare system that need access to pharmaceuticals. And so I just think we ought to uplift that and continue to call out this serious monopoly that is going on in our country. I want to again just thank you for the work, for the witnesses. Again, I think that we should have another hearing with the heads of all the pharmaceutical companies who are causing the absolute biggest damage to consumers, to those that need medicine, to need health care. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Chair now recognize Mr. Donalds from Florida for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And first of all, Mr. Chairman, I do want to recognize fellow Floridian, Mr. Duane, Dr. Duane, my apologies. I want to make sure I get it right. Thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time to come up here. The rest of the witnesses, thank you so much for your time as well. Dr. Duane, I'm going to start with you. In your testimony, you described PBMs as the monster in a nightmare. You care to elaborate on that? And also, do you think the rest of the witness panel would agree with your characterization?
So, my wife and I bought the pharmacy with an SBA loan. We saved up what money we needed in order to put the money down. The rest of it we used an SBA loan for. That was in 2016. Since 2016, PBM vertical integration, the steering that they do to push their patients to their own affiliated pharmacies has increased dramatically. If I knew then what I know now, I probably wouldn't have done the same thing. So in that, I say that what I saw to be a wonderful opportunity, what I hope can still be a great opportunity for my community, is in peril because specifically the things that we've talked about today. So in that, what we believe to be the real American dream, owning your own business, owning your own destiny, that kind of thing, it's been a whole lot tougher than what we thought it would be.
Okay. Anybody else want to comment? Dr. Atkins, Mr. Baker?
Yes, I would agree. As I mentioned in my testimony, when I first became a physician, I could just focus on taking care of patients. Now, every day I have to fight a faceless corporation who doesn't do what I do, doesn't understand what I do, and really doesn't care. They try to tell me how to take care of my patients, what drugs I can and cannot use. They take prescriptions from my patients, delay their care, delay them. And another example of the mail order, I've had patients where some chemotherapy agents require a certain temperature for the drug. So these medications are sometimes left on their front porch in the heat of the summer. So when they get the drug, it may be too hot, and then we don't know if it's still effective. And sometimes the drugs are lost and the patient's still charged. These are obstacles for patients. Sometimes PBMs also mandate the use of an innovator product instead of using a less expensive biosimilar. And all these things interfere with patient care. They also destroy the patient's hope and destroy their quality of life.
Okay. Mr. Baker, I can see you.
Thank you.
You have bated breath over there, Mr. Baker. Go ahead.
Yes, no, thank you. And I think even a different spin on this, I think we've talked a lot about the independent pharmacist and the patient impact, but even from the employer perspective, we deal with a lot of the largest employers in the country, and they don't get access to their data. So they don't really know what they're paying for their medications. They don't see at the claim level how much rebate dollars are making back to buy down the cost of their health care. So this lack of data is a real problem. If we go to any manufacturers and ask what they're paying for aluminum, what they're paying for tires, what they're paying for any of the other vendor services that they use, they can tell you almost exactly at that CFO level. But for some reason, when it comes to PBMs, everybody's okay saying, well, gosh, I don't get the data, I don't know. And that lack of data causes a lot of real problems in our opinion.
Mr. Baker, real quick, and probably in the last minute and a half, can you expand on the transparency piece of it, and really how do you think transparency through PBMs? And by the way, I see you over there, Claudia Devant, worked with her when I was back in the state legislature when we took on some reforms to PBMs back in Florida. But could you comment to what those adjustments federally would kind of look like, and what that level of transparency would mean for consumers and for medical professionals, and obviously in the field of medicine?
Yes, thank you. I think it goes back to, again, if you look at any other industry, consumers can make a decision on how much they want to pay for something and what profit is okay. That's the basic form of capitalism. And I think we've tried to live in a world where that applies to the pharmacy industry, and unfortunately it doesn't, because that same level of visibility into cost and profit do not exist in our space. And because of that, then it has continued to drive up profits that hurt American corporations. They need to then continue to increase premiums for their overall health plan. And then unfortunately, all the people where 55% of self-funded employers use coinsurance and high deductible health plans, when those PBMs are preferring brand over lower cost generic options, when the patient shows up at the pharmacy counter, they have to pay a percentage of a much higher cost. So pretty significantly across the board, those higher cost decisions are made. They're made in a way that's always, to me, at the detriment of the American corporation and family, and it absolutely needs to be something we continue to address.
Okay. Well, listen, thanks so much for everybody being here. Mr. Chairman, a great hearing. We should continue this work, and I'll yield back.
Chairman yields back. Chair recognizes Mr. Frost from Florida for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Hello, thank you all so much for being here. According to the AARP, nearly 3 in 10 Floridians have stopped taking prescription medications because of the cost. Big Pharma's massive profits are being paid for literally by the lives of our people. It's very important that we in Congress understand the practices and that lead to higher drug prices. And one of these practices entails PBMs offering pharmaceutical companies prime placement on a health insurer's list of covered medications in exchange for steeper discounts or rebates on drugs. Mr. Baker, can you briefly walk us through how exactly the specific rebate process works?
Yes, thank you, sir. And I think the best way to do that is through an example. We've talked for years in the industry about the biosimilars coming for Humira. Humira is the largest pharmaceutical drug in the history of the world, $200 billion medication. We now have lower cost generic alternatives available. Very first biosimilar that came out at 2 list prices. One, what we call high WAC, high rebate. So it was a 5% discount off what's almost a $9,000 a month drug. The second one was a low WAC, low rebate, 55% off. So as my previous comments just made, when we think about somebody who's got coinsurance or deductible and they have to show up at the pharmacy counter and pay a percentage, high is bad. The other issue is there is no visibility on how much of those rebate dollars are actually being paid into the system to, make cost of healthcare better. So we're living in a world where most PBMs continue to pick the high WAC, high rebate because they like the lack of transparency that goes into those rebate dollars. They can siphon some of that money off. And we really don't know if which one of these is cheaper, but it should be going to the lower cost option in our opinion.
And some would say that the current system incentivizes drug companies to have higher prices so they can give higher discounts, rebates to PBMs. Do you agree with that?
I would agree with that, yes, sir.
Florida consistently ranks as the most popular place to retire in America. However, with a larger population of seniors comes a larger population of folks vulnerable to healthcare challenges, and that essentially especially sensitive to the price of prescription drugs. Dr. Atkins, you testified about a case in which your patient insurance company charged her a copay of $1,500 per month for a drug she needed to treat her cancer. That's simply unaffordable for many Americans. In fact, most Americans, over 60%, can't afford an unexpected $400 bill tomorrow. What happens to patients whose doctors aren't able to take the time out of their busy day to see if their prescriptions can be obtained for a more affordable price?
Most of those patients just won't take the medication, and then that will affect their life expectancy.
Dr. Duane, my first question for you is, can you briefly, and hello to another fellow Floridian, Duval. My question for you is, can you briefly share the important role of independent pharmacies like yours, what role they play in the community, especially for those who face barriers to accessing healthcare?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So my pharmacies are located in lower income parts of Duval County. We're kind of the hub. It's more than just, here are your medicines. We put the pills from a big bottle into a littler bottle for you. I have people that bring letters from their bank or from the electric company and ask me to read them because they're functionally illiterate. I have people who ask, my HMO is telling me I have to see a new doctor. I need a new primary care doctor. Do you have any recommendations? Who else do you see that comes through here? So it's much more important to the community than just the actual prescription filling process. I'll say that Representative earlier asked about an article from the Journal of the American Medical Association about what happens when a community pharmacy, especially an independent community pharmacy, closes. People get sicker when that happens. In that zip code, when a community pharmacy closes, their blood pressure goes up. They have more heart disease. There are more heart attacks. These are things that we can definitively link to the absence or presence of a community or independent pharmacy in a particular zip code. So it's vital for the community.
And PBMs have a lot to answer for when it comes to the sky-high prices of drugs, but big pharmaceutical companies, like Representative Garcia pointed out, have been price gouging for years. This is something that personally impacted me. In 2017, Mylan, the pharmaceutical company responsible for EpiPen, settled a $465 million class action lawsuit over a scheme to avoid paying rebates so they can maximize profits. In 2016, an EpiPen 2-pack cost folks $313, according to the suit. Now, it costs between $650 and $700. 4 years ago, I almost died because I didn't have an EpiPen. I carry one everywhere I go now. If you weren't able to afford it and you have an anaphylactic attack, you die. Dr. Duane, what can be, almost no time left, but real quick, Dr. Duane, what can be done to level the playing field so independent pharmacies like yours can keep serving our communities and hard-to-reach populations?
Yeah, I mean, it's just very difficult for us to compete when the person that we're trying to compete with holds all the cards. When the person who makes the contract is also the person who owns the competitor, which is also the person who increasingly owns the doctor's office, which is also increasingly the person who owns the insurance company. You can't hope to compete with that. So I think anything that's addressed as far as looking at how they stacked up, how they got to be that stacked up, and how we can make sure that there's still level playing field within that system of integration.
Of course. Thank you so much for your time. I yield back.
Chair now recognize Mr. Sessions from Texas for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. I've been sitting here for an hour and a half or so and not sure that we really get it right. This slide shows, I hope you can see it, cost plus drugs, which Congressman Higgins showed, cost annually $499, CVS pricing $110,000. We've heard about how great this administration was at lowering drug prices. We've heard how great it is to have everybody go on Medicare. The bottom line is that there's money here. What did the administration at the time they cut the deal, what did they think about this, and did they not look at this price? It's one thing to blame the drug manufacturers. It's another thing to look at what the consumer pays. And I'm not sure we've gotten to that. Perhaps we have, Dr. Baker, but please help me to understand, what did the administration do when they saw this, or did they ignore it? Dr. Baker? Mr. Baker?
Yep, no, thank you, sir. What I would say is this is a very interesting example. It's a generic drug, there's no rebate, so nobody can have any rebate conversations around it. This is simply pure cost. In this situation—
By the way, let the record reflect that each of you on this panel, or at least several of you, are agreeing with what you're saying. Please
Correct.
continue, sir.
Yes, thank you. In this situation, it's a drug that gets mailed. We've talked a lot about the impact on independent pharmacies. Many of these specialty and oral oncolytic drugs, maybe if you want to mail them, that's okay, because they don't need special patient monitoring requirements. But many specialty drugs are injectable. They have very bad side effects. And in my opinion, the mailman, when they force people to go to their own specialty pharmacy and mail it to your home, is not the best person for injection technique. Probably an independent pharmacist would be much better at that. So
I could agree with that,
Yep.
but go to this difference. What did the administration see when they were trying to thoughtfully help the American public and the consumer? What did they do about this? Because they're the ones that, by and large, has universal access to this problem. We talk about Congress all the time. Our young chairman and others do want to fix this. What did the administration do about this?
to my knowledge, I've seen most of the regulation focused on brand manufacturers. With this being a generic medication, I'm not aware of anything that's occurred to fix that problem.
But this is big.
It's a big problem.
Is this an isolated problem? No, it's not. So there's more work to be done, I think, is what I would say. More work to be done. What should be done, in my opinion, is why we're having this hearing today. We're trying to filter out things, but the bottom line is that this costs somebody $499 and this costs somebody $110,000. Who paid this?
I would bet most of that payment came out of the plan sponsor in that situation, and then ultimately everybody who's part of the plan had to pick up the costs.
So they spread it out.
Yes, sir.
What advantage would a person have who did this? Is it an individual person, a person perhaps who was paying out of an HSA? What kind of person would this be versus this being a plan? What is this? I know what it is, but what kind of person benefited from that?
I would say the person who bore more of the cost and could actually see what those total costs were. In the $110,000 situation, I guarantee that cost was buried in millions of claims and nobody's really looking at it because they don't know where to.
And I'm talking about maybe an end user or a person who paid this. What kind of person is this? Is this a person who was maybe uninsured? And we've heard that there's some disparity there. What kind of person comes to Cost Plus Drugs or Drug RX or Blink or any of these other seemingly smaller, perhaps, companies, but non-PBMs?
Yeah, I think the root of the problem stems, and you can look at the fact that 10% of all prescription drugs filled in America go to cash discount cards, and 85% of those people who use those have insurance. So it's a classic case where insurance is not driving to the lowest cost, and now American consumers have to try to figure out this arcane system on their own to find a medication they can afford.
Do you think, and Mr. Chairman, I know I'm at my time, do you think an answer is possible by this committee? Do you think that we can study it and pinpoint those problems, whereas the administration evidently didn't go that direction?
I'm very encouraged by the overall positive comments we're hearing from everybody that we're talking to today, that there could be a solution that we could figure out. Yes, sir.
Well, I'm hopeful that there are people in the American public, perhaps other people who have great knowledge have on this, and I hope that they will write our young chairman. I'm the subcommittee chairman for government operations. Not saying all this falls in my bailiwick, but I hope people will give us feedback. I want to thank each of you today, and I think we're getting closer by having the hearing today. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Absolutely. Thank you. Chair recognizes Ms. Ballant from Vermont for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In many rural communities like Windham County, Vermont, where I live, pharmacies play a vital role in meeting community health care needs. Just like Dr. Duane, you said earlier, I mean, that resonated so much with me, all of what you said about the role that independent pharmacies play. It's really beyond dispensing medication. It's providing basic medical information services, providing counseling. And, you know, at one point I was between health care plans and the paperwork wasn't done. And my independent pharmacist, whose name was Frank, I came in, and my asthma medication was hundreds of dollars a month. He came in, he said, you know, Becca, it hasn't come in, it's not running. He literally gave me the medication. He said, I know where you live. Come back when you have it straightened out. That is the kind of care that you get from independent pharmacy. So thank you for doing what you're doing for your community. Now, PBMs, as we all know, is what we've been talking about today. They contract with pharmacies to create these pharmacy networks, and whether or not patients use pharmacies in these networks can affect the amount that patients pay at the counter. And these arrangements can drive patients away from independent pharmacies in their communities. And in fact, I had a pharmacist tell me at one of my independent pharmacies, I can't really fill this for you, or I'm going to take an incredible hit on my bottom line. And you've been a customer with us for years, and it's paining me to tell you you're going to have to fill it somewhere else. So when I was the leader of the Senate in Vermont, we tackled the problem by enacting legislation that prohibits PBMs from reimbursing pharmacies in Vermont less than they would reimburse PBM affiliates for the same services, which I think is critically important. And Dr. Duane, I know Representative Frost was asking you some about this, but I'm wondering, now that we have a little bit more time, can you explain why it's so difficult for independent community pharmacies like yours to be part of these pharmacy networks? Just lay it all out for us.
So it's twofold. The first thing is that they can afford to offer themselves contracts that are poor, and then they can offer me the same contract. Yeah. They will happily, when they're vertically integrated, lose money out of one pocket to ensure that the money stays in the other pocket. So it's a lose-lose.
And you don't have another pocket.
No, ma'am, I don't.
Yeah.
So if I participate in that contract and it's a poor contract, I run out of business all the quicker and they're happy. And if I don't participate in the contract and I close my doors to those patients, then those patients find themselves into an affiliated pharmacy and they're able to keep that money.
Yeah, and this is the reason why we have lost over half of our independent pharmacies in Vermont, for this exact reason. And we know, and you talked about this, that each of the 3 largest PBMs also owns a specialty pharmacy that they use to dispense medications that treat rare or complex health problems. But these drugs do not legally have to be dispersed through a specialty pharmacy. And any licensed pharmacy can dispense a specialty drug as long as that drug can be purchased from a manufacturer or authorized wholesale distributor. So, Mr. Baker, how do PBMs use the specialty pharmacies that they own to incentivize patients to fill their prescriptions at the specialty pharmacy instead of Dr. Duane's independent pharmacy?
Yeah, I would say they don't necessarily incentivize anything, they mandate. It's you cannot go to his pharmacy, you have to come to mine.
Thank you for just like cutting right through that.
Yes,
Not an
ma'am.
incentive, just a mandate.
Mm-hmm.
So it is not hyperbole to say that independent pharmacies in so many of our rural communities are the heart of the community. That's where people get the medical attention and advice that they need, especially as rural America is losing so many of its healthcare providers. The pharmacy is critically important to communities like my own. And so it is really important that we understand the ways that PBM practices, maybe steering patients away from these pharmacies and making it impossible for these pharmacies to stay open. So it's a critical part of the ongoing work that I see that we have to do, and that Democrats, I feel like, have been doing for years to try to make medication more affordable and accessible to all. I'm so glad that we're having this hearing. I really appreciate this, Mr. Chair. This is part of a problem that is making it incredibly difficult for rural Americans to stay healthy. It's as simple as that. Thank you. I yield back.
Very good. Chair now recognizes Ms. McLean from Michigan for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you all for being here on this very important topic. I think what is encouraging is if you look around, we all agree finally there's a problem and it needs to be fixed, right? It doesn't matter what side of the aisle you're on, what color your skin is, what race, we have a problem, which is wonderful. Now we can get down to the business to fixing it. What I want to make sure that we first understand is to make sure I understand it correctly. And if I'm correct, pharmacy benefit managers were originally meant to facilitate negotiations, really to drive the cost of prescription drugs down for their patients. Correct? I mean, originally, I don't think it was done with malice. That was the original. However, PBMs, it seems like, has evolved into middlemen with an outsized role in the pharmaceutical marketplace, operating really behind the scenes to manipulate drug costs, control access to certain medications, and ultimately decide the payment pharmacies receive for all of their own benefits. So it seems that it's switched. Am I directionally tracking?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's switched. The main driver is still Big Pharma. But to your point, there's all these other ways they're trying to make money, the PBMs are trying to make money, that's distorting that original.
I mein, the largest PBMs control 80% of the market, right? Each own their own pharmacies, disincentivizing negotiations and enabling them to further benefit really from higher prices. So I have a good understanding of what it was and what it's evolved to now. Mr. Baker, real quick, what do you believe the #1 goal, a priority should be?
Yes, thank you. I think we've used the word transparency quite a bit here today as witnesses. The other thing I think is important to point out, we have tried to say as a public benefit corporation, how are we going to be a completely unconflicted PBM? So how am I going to make sure I'm always making decisions in the right vein for our clients and their members? And I think a big part of that is we've made this decision never to own our own pharmacy. I think the day I start deciding what I pay myself, conflict can occur, and that's not a really good thing.
Okay.
My mail order pharmacy, if I were to have one, again, does not provide the same level of service as we clearly get from independent and other community pharmacies. And we think the overall healthcare picture needs to be viewed, not just an insular profit I can make off a drug that I dispense for my own.
So who would benefit from increased transparencies in the PBM world?
I think the American corporation would benefit greatly by knowing what they're actually paying for medications and being able to competitively figure out if they want to continue doing what they're doing. I think the American taxpayer would benefit greatly from that as well.
Why do you think the PBMs are against transparency? I can't figure that out.
We hide behind the term proprietary a lot in this industry. Everything's proprietary, everything's hidden. It's going to hurt my ability to negotiate and really get this better price. I think we've heard that so long. I personally am callous to it. Everybody likes to
Do you believe that?
I do not, no.
Okay.
I think we can look at the facts, and costs go up every year. So we can continue doing what we're doing, and guess what? Costs are going to go up. Right. Now's the time we need to try to do something.
Just a really point of clarification, which is, it is true that when a PBM negotiates a better price for from a drug maker, that unveiling that price is probably not the best thing. But that's what they're using as a red herring. We need to know, for example, an employer who's paying for their services needs to know. And there's a way to keep that private and still make sure that there's safeguards over there.
And I appreciate that. In the interest of time, because I only have a minute left, what I'm trying to make a correlation to is we all agree there's a problem, which I think is dogs and cats living together. Okay. In order to fix a problem, I think we have to fully understand what the problem is. And the more data and the more we can see, right, the more transparency there is, will help us figure out which lever to pull to fix the problem. Would y'all agree with that?
Yes.
It's amazing to me, and it always seems like when we don't want to be transparent, I mean, I come from the financial planning world. We have to be transparent. We have a prospectus that we have to give all of our clients to see where our dollars come from. That was mandated by Congress. Quite simply, do you think if we made the PBMs or this process more transparent, do you think that would help us identify the problems to get to the best solution?
Yes, and I love your analogy around financial services. Everybody knows the prospectus and what is happening on those. When it comes to healthcare, self-funded employers do not put that out, right? They don't know how to say, here's the profit being made, here's the fees, here's everything accounted. So you plan participant knows that information. I think that's a great analogy.
And it leads to a lot of mistrust as well. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, witnesses. I yield back.
Chair now recognizes Ms. Lee from Pennsylvania for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm excited to be able to talk about something in this committee that is actually meaningful to American people, lowering prescription drug costs and increasing access to affordable care. I'm happy we all agree that drug prices are out of control, yet we seem to be the only country suffering from this problem. This committee's 3-year investigation into drug companies discover many ways that pharmaceutical companies prioritize profits over people, including flagrant anti-competitive behavior to maintain their monopoly pricing. Mr. Isasi, how specifically has anti-competitive behavior led to higher drug prices?
It's driven out competition. It's created consolidated power amongst individual drug makers, and they raise their prices without, unchecked.
Thank you. This committee also found that drug companies were specifically targeting the U.S. for high drug prices because Medicare can't negotiate the price of drugs directly with those companies. So, Mr. Isasi, can you explain how the U.S. is different from so many other countries in this way, and how that's led to higher drug prices?
Yeah, that's exactly right. We are talking about an industry that is over $1 trillion industry a year. Half of their profits are coming just from the U.S. and Canada out of that $1 trillion industry. So they are fleecing Americans. And until we passed the Inflation Reduction Act, we had no ability to get in there and negotiate a fair price. And it's really important to point out Part D, which is the benefit that allows seniors to get prescription drugs, so important, was designed so there was no real negotiation. It was designed so there were small regional prescription drug plans who couldn't really negotiate, had no negotiating power. So it was, by design, a terrible deal for the American public.
Mm-hmm. People across the country have been struggling for years to afford health care. Though important, drug prices are just one piece of that puzzle. How do drug prices inflate overall healthcare costs that families pay? And what does this mean on a practical level for someone who relies on high-cost medication?
Well, what we know is in many cases, say a quarter of all the premium increases you're experiencing are because drug prices are going up so fast. And what's really important to say is, for lots of people out there aren't taking prescription drugs, right? So they don't even realize that every year their premiums are going up because prescription drug companies are fleecing them. And it goes into the risk pool of your employer, the risk pool of your insurance program, et cetera.
So in keeping with that point, more than half of overall spending goes to so-called specialty drugs, even though they make up about 2% of the medicines dispensed. This designation is defined differently across market by PBMs. Mr. Baker, can you explain how PBMs' arbitrary decision-making on whether to label a drug specialty is affecting patients?
Yes, absolutely, and that's an incredible point. In the pharmacy industry, we can pretty well come to an agreement on what is considered a brand and generic drug. It all stops there. So this world of specialty has really started growing since about 2014, 2015. It is exponentially growing, to your point, being 50% or more of all spend today. And PBMs can call any drug they want a specialty. Every PBM will have a different specialty list. Every PBM could have a different specialty list for a different type of fulfillment channel. So the specialty list that we use for independent pharmacies could be different than the one I use for my own PBM pharmacy if I wanted to use it. So this lack of transparency and ability to have oversight on what is considered specialty, limited distribution, or other does drive to a lot of profiteering.
Thank you. In the end, this is actually a somewhat simple conversation. Drug companies set drug prices. If the drug companies set lower prices for medications, American families would pay lower prices. That's sad. It's important to understand the context in which those drug companies operate and who they operate with. Americans shouldn't have to choose between feeding their families and their diabetes medication. We shouldn't have to go into bankruptcy to treat our loved one's cancer. And we shouldn't have to raise thousands of dollars on a GoFundMe site when we're injured in an accident. This is a uniquely American problem. Our healthcare system is broken and rotted to its core on every level. PBMs are just a part of a greater problem, and we cannot allow them to be a scapegoat to avoid addressing true issues. Americans deserve universal health care. We deserve Medicare for all. And with that, I will yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. Chair recognizes Ms. Boebert from Colorado for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Duane, I think it's been mentioned many times here today, and I apologize that I wasn't here for a lot of it. We have other committees going on as well, but we've seen an increase in prices for medication and treatments over the past few years. You would agree?
Yeah, I would absolutely
Yes.
agree with that.
And I think that you all have elaborated as far as the why, and you're welcome to elaborate more if you'd like. But do you see that patients leave their prescriptions at pharmacies because they can no longer pay for it?
They absolutely do in my pharmacy, yes. That happens more than should make anyone comfortable.
I actually have a fun little story. My staff is probably going to talk to me about this later, but I left a prescription at a pharmacy once. I went to get birth control, and I was there at the counter and went to pay for it, and the price was very, very high. I said, wow, is this a 3-6-month prescription? No, ma'am, this is 1 month. And I said, it's cheaper to have a kid. And I left it there, and now I have my third son, Caden Boebert, and so I'm actually, it turned out to be a really great thing, but I personally experienced that when times were tough. But thank you so much for your indulgence there, and talk to the team about that comment later. Excuse me, please state your name for me.
Isasi.
Isasi, thank you. Mr. Isasi, now you state that drug launch prices have increased 20% per year from 2008 to 2021. Other than inflation, what other factors caused this price hike?
Drug makers' greed.
And you state that there are on average 125 patient applications per drug that extends their monopolies and blocks competition up to 4 decades. What kind of distinct ability do these patients have from others to make them patentable?
Right. They're exceeding their patent. Their patent was supposed to last 9 years, maybe 11 years, if it's or 12 years, and they're going for 40 years because they're just suing their way into greed.
And how could we end patent abuse without restricting someone's patentability?
I mean, this is so important. By really focusing in on this kind of greed, what we're actually doing is ending drug companies' ability to make money by just extending the existing intervention. We want them to stop making money at the 9-year and go find something else. And every year we let them keep making money from that same drug. We are killing innovation. So it's critically important.
Thank you. And Dr. Atkins, as an oncologist, can you give us an example in which PBMs have obstructed your patients from getting the medications that you've prescribed to them?
We could stay here all day, but I'll just give one.
Yes, ma'am.
Particularly what I mentioned
Doctor.
earlier in my statement that I wrote a prescription on October 14th. I saw the patient 2 weeks later. He still did not have the medication. Asked him what had happened because we thought we could fill it at my dispensary, my practice. I found out from my pharmacist that our dispensary sent the prescription someplace else, and then the patient's PBM, CVS Caremark, took the prescription, told the patient, we haven't heard from your doctor. And we're like, that's not true. We've been going back and forth. Anyway, the patient got his medication on December 1st. So this happens very frequently.
Right, which presents consequences to your patients.
Definitely,
Yes. Thank you very much, Doctor. Mr. Baker, on May 16th, your company changed the name and has a new tagline of patients over profits. What prompted this change?
Yeah, I think it really falls to a lot of the conversation here today. We think you can run a very viable organization that drives to highest clinical quality, lowest net cost, and not focus on profit being your sole endpoint. So we really want to make sure that everything that we do and everybody we work with knows that patients come first. And you know what? This is a hundreds of billions of dollar a year industry. There's plenty of money left over to create a market-driven solution that still
Agreed.
creates good profit for people.
Yes, and in your opinion, do you oftentimes see PBMs using rebates or promote expensive brand drugs, even if they don't work as well on patients?
We do. You can publicly available pull a lot of PBM formularies and continually see brand name drugs that have lost patent exclusivity that are now generics, but those are still the drugs that are preferred on those formularies.
Thank you very much, Mr. Baker. And Dr. Atkins, do you mind explaining the protocol of step therapy or fail first?
Sure, fail first. One example I gave are the medications for nausea and vomiting for chemotherapy. There are certain drugs we want to use with certain chemotherapy because some drugs cause more nausea than others. So I may want to use drug X, and the PBM will say, no, you have to use drug number A, and if the patient fails that by getting really, really sick, then I can go back to the drug I want to use. That's one example of step therapy or fail first.
So you've seen patients be affected?
Oh,
by
yes.
it. Yes. Do you think that patients are being failed by PBMs and their insurers?
I think they are. I mean, as a physician, my job is to take care of patients the best way I know how. And when I give a recommendation or write a prescription, and then someone else who does not do what I do, does not have my training, stands patients, that's definitely failing the patient.
Thank you. Well, I'm very excited to have had this hearing today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. It sounds like that we have a lot of things that we could work together on. Thank you so much to our witnesses here for providing your testimonies and your expertise here in this committee room today. I hope that we can provide solutions to help you help your patients and to get this problem that we all see as very detrimental under control. Thank you so much. I yield.
Thank you. Chair recognizes Ms. Crockett from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to each of you for being here and being willing to repeat yourselves a lot. So what I'm going to try to do is, number one, applaud all my colleagues, which, you know, this committee tends to be a little partisan. And so I didn't know that we could actually agree on much of anything. And so, you know, today has revealed that miracles are still happening in the world. But I think that we all agree that Americans deserve an affordable healthcare system that works, and the one that we have right now is broken. But it doesn't have to be broken, because we know that other countries are doing this so much better. But we are supposed to be the gold standard in the world. And so what I want to talk about is a little bit of my experiences, and I most likely will maybe have a question for Dr. Atkins. When I swore into Congress, I honestly didn't know what to expect as it relates to the number one constituent issue. If I had to guess, I'd assumed people would generally call to get guidance regarding tax returns. After all, I was swearing in the thick of tax season. And financially, people were struggling, but instead, the number one topic of our phone calls was regarding Medicaid and Medicare. I was floored, but it was so overwhelming that I recruited an amazing constituent advocate by the name of Mary from the hospital sector to assist us and minimize the learning curve of all the complexities regarding Medicaid and Medicare. I thought, great, we're off to an amazing start. The Democrats in the 117th, along with President Biden, were the architects of the Inflation Reduction Act, which, as mentioned over and over in this hearing, dramatically reduced some of the pharmaceutical burdens on our most vulnerable populations. But there's still more work to do, which is why we're here. The question is, how did we get here, though? I mean, as mentioned before, we are the United States, and so over time, we have learned that certain medications are more vulnerable to drug shortages when there's a lack of economic incentives to produce them. And so I want to talk to you about a constituent call that I received, because it feels like this is a multi-layered issue. So just this week, Melissa called our office, and Melissa also I think she wanted to make sure that I got the message. She decided that she was going to tweet at me as well. And so she tweeted at me on all my accounts to make sure that I knew, but it's just that serious. And that's what I want people to understand. This price gouging, while we heard a conversation about not being able to get birth control, isn't necessarily life or death. When Melissa called because there is a shortage as it relates to cancer medications. Dr. Atkins, I know that you just mentioned some things as it relates to cancer, but are you aware that there is currently a massive shortage that we're experiencing in this country as it relates to cancer medications?
Yes. Right now, there are several drugs there are a shortage of. One is a medication called carboplatin, and it's a very old drug, so it's only generic, and there are not a lot of incentives to keep making it. So right now, as a matter of fact, I talked to my pharmacist about this yesterday before I came here. I said, where do we stand with carboplatin? And he told me, well, we're allowed to order based on what we ordered last month, so we're good through June, but after June, we don't know. And so every other oncology practice in this country is experiencing the same thing. Another medication that's on shortage is a medication called 5-FU. 5-FU is the base drug for every GI cancer, colon, stomach, appendiceal, esophageal. So these are real problems that we face every day. And that's not on top of the price of drugs.
Exactly. And so it's frustrating because literally Melissa called our office and Kylie, who answered my phone, sent a message talking about the fact that she was almost in tears when she got off the phone because Melissa is scared that she literally may lose her life because she cannot gain access in this country. What is frustrating for me, I am from the state of Texas, as mentioned, and even in the state of Texas, there was a bill that was just passed, and this bill is creating an organization within the state of Texas so that we import drugs from Canada because of the cost that our drugs are placing on our most vulnerable. The final point that I really want to make, though, is that we are also right now in the midst of a fight as it relates to the debt ceiling. And right now, this is the partisan issue. I'm going to tell you that it's quite frustrating that we are talking about potentially not funding folk that are already struggling, because this hearing is about the fact that most people can't afford these drugs as it is. And now we're talking about they may not even have the coverages of Medicaid and Medicare because we're talking about cutting them off. We deserve better. The American people deserve better. And I appreciate your fight. We're in this together. Thank you so much, and I yield back.
Chair now recognizes Mr. Fry from South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for having this hearing today. This is actually pretty remarkable, just the back and forth, the camaraderie a little bit that we see on both sides of the aisle. Last year, PBMs raked in billions of dollars in profits. This effectively means that every American, based on the profits, pay about $70 to PBMs just to have access to prescription drugs. Drug manufacturers receive 37% of that money spent on prescription drugs, which is a decrease of from 50% in 2013. PBMs are retaining 69% of the money hardworking Americans are spending. And I get these figures, Mr. Chairman, from this great, and I think Dr. Carter is going to be in here, but if he doesn't make it, I'd like request unanimous consent to put his paper, Pulling Back the Curtain on PBMs, A Path Towards Affordable Prescription Drugs, into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. One of the things that we touched on a little bit, and I know the ranking member did and Ms. Boebert did, are failed first policies or step therapy. Dr. Atkins, in your role as an oncologist, how frequently are your patients required to fail first a medication?
I couldn't give an exact percentage, but one time is too many, as far as I'm concerned. I'll give another example. I had a patient who had stage 4 breast cancer. There's one medication I wanted to give her called a CDK4/6 inhibitor. And the one I wanted to use, her PBM said, no, you have to use this one. And if she fails that one, you can use the one you want to use. Well, the thing that was frustrating was, one, they're getting in the way of me taking care of my patient. That's number one. Number two, per the national guidelines, if a patient fails one CDK4/6 inhibitor, you do not give them another one. So they're getting in the way of me taking care of my patient, and also trying to treat a patient without a license and trying to treat that patient in the wrong manner. So
right, they're not medical
frustrating.
doctors.
No, they're not.
They're not licensed in your state. They don't have the training that you have, is that correct?
That is correct.
But they are making these decisions, and we can speculate why. We have a lot of reasons why, but they're making these decisions without being in the room, the clinical room with you and that patient.
Exactly.
Why do you think they do that? What do they cite as a reason when they deny a patient?
Well, the real reason is money. They do whatever's more profitable for them. They'll say it's for safety or to maybe rein in unnecessary spending, but that is not the truth. The truth is, the more they inhibit me, the more money they make.
Right, and so what does your patient do when they're required to fail first?
The patient is very upset. They lose hope. Their life expectancy is shortened. And with oncology, you have the cancer diagnosis and you have the emotional toxicity of the whole diagnosis. So if someone can't get their treatment on time, the treatment that their doctor recommends, it pretty much destroys the patient emotionally.
Right, and you're a very competent doctor. When your patients call, I'm sure you call them back, but you see these barriers or these delays even within the office setting. When a patient is required to fail first, they have to call your office back, correct?
Yes.
And get another prescription, is that right?
Yes.
And you have other patients that you're seeing. You're incredibly busy, and so in one of the most vulnerable moments of their life, they don't have the ability to get the treatment that they need because these PBMs are requiring you to fail first.
Exactly.
Without that medical training.
Exactly.
And this isn't just cancer, doctor, right? These are a whole host of other medical conditions, right? I mean, if you look at opioid use disorder, you're required to fail first on that. Congressman Higgins talked about MS. You're required to fail first on that. These aren't just cancer drugs. These are a whole litany of conditions that somebody may have that they're required to fail first.
That's correct.
So you have the delays. You have also probably, is this fair to say, that you have an increased cost to the patient because they're constantly having to go back to the doctor?
That's correct, yes.
So who is this saving money for?
PBM, I suppose, but not the patient.
Well, I mean, based on the data, I would say that it doesn't even save them money.
I think if the patient doesn't take the medication or the patient is no longer alive, they may save money by not providing care.
Can you talk about the dangers this poses with life-threatening illnesses like cancer in your instance? What dangers does this pose, these delays pose to a patient?
Several. One, patients may not get the medication. I'll have one example where there's a patient who was prescribed a medication called Cabometyx. So they wanted to get the medication at the drugstore, whether the pharmacy where the physician was. Usually at our office, we have a patient account manager who will help patients get assistance for drugs.
Are you aware of any instances where a fail-first policy led to a severe disability for a patient, maybe yours or somebody else's?
I would say, yeah, a lot of nausea. If someone has a lot of nausea and vomiting, they are very sick unnecessarily. You know, if they fail the first, they're not allowed to use the medication I want to use if they fail something at first. Yes, I would say nausea and vomiting is probably the most common one.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know I'm out of time, but without a yield back.
Chair now recognizes Ms. Stansberry from New Mexico for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to say thank you also to our witnesses. Thank you for serving, caring for, and fighting for our families and communities. I personally believe that healthcare is a human right, a fundamental right. The ability to access healthcare obviously is not just about the dignity and well-being of our communities, but about the survival of our family members. Yet millions of Americans and thousands of New Mexicans struggle to access even the most basic care. In New Mexico, in my home state, over 60% of our community members are dependent on Medicaid and Medicare to receive care of any kind. We have one of the highest rates of Medicaid and Medicare need in the entire country. You know, today we've talked a lot about policy. We've talked about very technical issues around billing and insurance. But at the end of the day, what we're talking about is people's lives. These are our parents, our grandparents, our children. people who are unable to actually access life-saving care medications because, number one, they cannot afford it. Number two, in New Mexico, we have such a severe provider shortage, they're not actually able to access providers. And I think, as we heard today, these for-profit companies are helping to drive more and more care providers out of business. So when we talk about these issues, we're talking about the life and death of our communities. And for me, this is a very personal issue. I grew up in a very low-income family. Before the Affordable Care Act, I did not have health care insurance. I have watched as countless members of my community could not access care, could not access life-saving medication, and it's why I've spent much of my elected career since I was first elected in 2018 fighting to change this broken system, advocating in the state legislature to reform prescription drugs and prior authorizations and other necessary improvements in insurance, and here fighting for the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act. We've talked a lot this morning about the Inflation Reduction Act and the ways in which it will enable Medicare in particular to address prescription drug costs. But I was struck, Mr. Isasi, in your testimony, and I really appreciated that you provided a pretty detailed description of many of the ways we can build on the IRA to address these issues. So I wonder if you could briefly just share some of those solutions so that we can walk away with some real solutions today.
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. So first and foremost, we have to extend the negotiated price to the 180 million Americans who have employer-sponsored coverage, who right now don't get the benefit of that. Two, we have to expand the number of drugs. Right now, in 2026, we'll have 10 drugs negotiated, right? We should have at least 50 that are subject to negotiation. So those would be two really, really important reforms. Make sure the inflationary caps apply across all patient populations, et cetera.
Yeah, and in your testimony, you said, and I quote, that the Inflation Reduction Act is the most significant legislation ever passed by Congress to end the abusive price gouging by pharmaceutical companies. And I think a lot of people don't really know what the Inflation Reduction Act is. And not only did it address pharmaceutical prices, but it extended access to Medicaid in New Mexico for thousands of individuals. Those are lives that will be saved. Those are people who can go to see doctors like Dr. Atkins in order to get life-saving care and to get their medications. So what we do in this chamber isn't just a bunch of talking points. And, I want to add on the note that my colleague from Texas made, that while I do appreciate the bipartisan tone and tenor of this particular hearing, we are in the midst of a battle right now in the halls of this chamber over our debt ceiling. And part of the cost of that battle right now is our colleagues across the line are threatening to take away access to Medicaid for millions of Americans. So while we can sit here in this hearing room and talk about how discouraged we are that these for-profit companies are price gouging our elders and our family members, our friends across the aisle are actually trying to take away your health care right now. So let's be real about what's actually happening in the halls of the chambers of this Congress right now. So I appreciate the conversation. I do appreciate that we've talked about some real solutions today. I appreciate, Dr. Atkins, your lived experience and your sharing about your patients. Thank you for bringing those stories into this room. But if we really believe that healthcare is a human right, then it's not just about one hearing, one bipartisan hearing. It's about making sure that the laws that we pass, that the arguments that we have in these chambers actually reflect that we believe and are going to take action to make healthcare a reality for every American. And with that, I yield back.
Chair recognizes Mr. Timmons from South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think over the last few decades, we've been having this conversation about is healthcare a human right? I think that has been put to bed. I don't necessarily agree with the outcome of it, but I think for all intents and purposes, that has been ceded. So if that's the case, I would like to talk about the fact that rights come with responsibilities, and the American population is failing. 13% of the population of planet Earth is obese. 40% of the United States is. You go to overweight and obese, it goes up to 70% in the United States. Diabetes alone, 37 million Americans, of which about 95% have type 2 diabetes. That costs annually $237 billion in direct costs and $90 billion in lost productivity. And we're talking about costs, and we're nickel and diming where we can. That's what we do. But at the end of the day, we have to overhaul the system. We treat sickness. We do not facilitate health and wellness. And if you've been taking a pill for more than a couple weeks or months, you probably could have made life changes that would result in you no longer needing that pill. I own a CrossFit gym and a yoga studio. I have coached people from being type 2 diabetic to no longer having to take any drugs because of that. I have seen people lose 40 pounds, go from taking 15, 16 pills a day to taking 0 pills. So while we're talking about the costs associated with our current healthcare system, I think it's wrong for us to not have the really core conversation of we can't continue down this path. We can't even field a military. We can't even field a military. And our lost productivity, our healthcare system is failing. I guess, Dr. Atkins, I mean, do you agree that diet and exercise can solve the vast majority of illnesses facing Americans?
It plays a role. However, when I have a patient with cancer, my goal is to treat them. I'm not concerned about what happened before they got the diagnosis.
What's your probability of getting cancer if you're 200 pounds overweight and have not exercised at all? Is it higher or lower than if you are relatively fit?
It's higher. I don't know the exact percentage, but
Okay,
it's higher.
so it's higher. So again, even cancer, if you are not taking care of yourself, then you have a higher probability, which again, insurance is a game of underwriting risk, and you have to take into account the healthiest person with the least healthy person. And I guess we're just losing this personal responsibility component of all of this. So what are some ways that we could incentivize health and wellness? And I'm going to throw it out, but I mean, as far as I'm concerned, at some point there's got to be some sticks involved. We have to have carrots to facilitate health and wellness, but you can't. I always use alcohol. Or I mean, if you drink 2 handles of liquor a week, you will likely get cirrhosis of the liver eventually. And at some point, somebody's going to tell you this is the outcome. Where's the personal responsibility in that? Because they don't have any additional premiums. They have no change in their financial perspective. Do you think that we can find a way to incentivize, Dr. Atkins again, do you think that we can find a way to incentivize health and wellness and disincentivize unhealthy habits?
I'm sure there's a way, but I don't have an exact answer to that question.
Mr. Baker, what percent of of the prescriptions that are written are for longer than, let's just say, a month? How many people are chronically taking drugs?
I think we probably see about 65% of our medication fills for chronic needs and about 35% for acute, so antibiotics or other.
And Dr. Duane, I want my pharmacists to be incredibly competent and awesome. I don't want to know them, because if I know them, it means that I have made some decisions to get there. What percent of your clients do you have a personal? How many prescriptions do you fill? Do the individuals know your name?
Well, at an independent community pharmacy, I think the clientele may be self-selecting, so I would say that it's much higher. I would say a lot of my patients, the majority of my patients, I would say know me, know my family, know my story, ask about my children.
That's more because of a rural population as opposed to...
No, we're in more of an urban inner city population, but I just think it's because what those people are seeking out.
Okay. Well, again, I just really think that we need to find a way to incentivize good decisions and prioritize diet and exercise, because that will bring down the cost of healthcare for everyone if we have a healthier population and we don't have 68% of the United States population